Hello, everyone. This is the Developing Branching Narratives panel at LudoNarraCon 2020. First of all, I want to thank Fellow Traveler for having us. This is a really cool convention. Happens to be very timely since we're all at home anyway. It's kind of perfect for that. And my name is Graham Resnick. We've got an amazing panel lineup today for you. Wide range of writers and developers from across the gaming industry and beyond to talk about branching narratives. I think before we get into any of that, we should go around and introduce ourselves. I'm going to go clockwise on my screen, which might not make sense to anyone else. Christian, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you. My name is Christian Devine. I'm the writer for Life is Strange, The Awesome Adventures of Captain Spirit, and Life is Strange 2, and originally the first Deus Ex and John Romero's Daikatana. And thanks for having me.
Thank you. Sam, why don't you, Sam Barlow, why don't you go for it?
Hi, I'm Sam Barlow. I'm a game developer who's worked on a bunch of things, Silent Hill Shattered Memories, which branched in weird ways. Most recently, Her Story and Telling Lies, which were very non-linear, if not as branchy. Also did some branching interactive TV stuff with a show called War Games.
Right on. Karin, go for it.
Hi there, my name is Karin Weekes. I am up in finally sunny Edmonton up in Canada. I work at BioWare, 14 years as of last month. And I've worked on all three of the Dragon Age games, on Mass Effect 2 and 3 and Andromeda. I've worked on SWTOR, I've worked on Anthem, and probably some stuff I'm forgetting. So we do a little branching every now and then in some of our games.
And Sam Eggs, why don't you go for it?
Hi, I'm Sam Eggs. I worked with Karin at BioWare on Anthem. I've spent the last couple of years working at Insomniac Games. I'm now working on a game at a place that I can't talk about. And I also write books. I have a book coming out in June with Marvel called The Unstoppable Wasp. So if you're a book fan, it doesn't branch, unfortunately. And I'm working in some branching TV as well. Lots of NDA stuff, but fun.
Awesome. And I'm Graham Resnick. I was a co-writer with Larry Fessenden on Until Dawn and a bunch of other games from Supermassive, The Impatient, Man of Medan. I'm forgetting all of them, but there's a couple of them. And then some upcoming stuff that's not announced yet, secret. And I also did some live action interactive for Echo, working with Sam Barlow on a live action project. And yeah, my other background is in film and TV. I did a show called Dead Wax for Shudder, and have done a lot of music and sound design and other film stuff over the years. So I kind of fell into video game writing about 10 years ago with Until Dawn, and realized that it was not just a parallel passion for me along with film, but kind of a primary passion in terms of what I liked to experience content-wise. Growing up, I played Sierra games and then moving into more action games in the 90s. And then now with this kind of new renaissance, this new golden age or first golden age of interactive narrative, most of what I play is narrative-based games. I think we're in a really interesting time where there are no set rules for how to make a narrative interactive, and everyone's getting to try interesting things. More action games can have really, there are no set rules about how to make narrative a part of your experience. So we're seeing just a wild spectrum of cool and interesting ways to express an idea and a story across interactive experiences. One of the ways that I wanted to kick this off was by asking the group, and anyone can chime in to start, about what they think makes an interactive story branching. And I'll just clarify that by saying, I think that there are, just from the very most basic linear forms of storytelling, there are ways to make a non-interactive story have an element of interactivity to it. for example, a nonlinear movie like Pulp Fiction is a big pop culture example that is not interactive, but it forces the viewer to make choices about how to connect the story in their mind. So from there, what is actually branching narrative? It seems like it's such a wide open thing. And I'd be curious to see if anyone has a good, or at least a rudimentary idea in their heads about how they approach what that means. Open it up.
Class, Bueller.
Okay, well, I'll jump in. The stories that we work in at BioWare are pretty significantly branching. For me, it's interesting. My partner, Patrick, who also works at BioWare, and I were talking to our kids. We have 15 and 12-year-old sons who are very interested in all things game design. So they're always watching YouTube and things like that. And so we were talking about procedurally generated content and is that a thing you can use with branching? And we were saying that for me anyway, there's such a wide spectrum. So like at a basic level, branching would be, are you presented with a decision where you can choose at least one of two options at its base level, not just reading through a book. So anytime a player or a viewer takes an active part in deciding which ways the plots are going to go, for me, that's what interactivity is.
Yeah, I
So
agree. And I don't think it has to be limited to like what you might think of as a dialogue wheel or dialogue choices. I think to Karen's point, anytime that a player makes a decision through gameplay or any other aspect of the world, they pick something up that they don't realize, they're making a choice between picking up item A or item B, and that affects something later. Anytime the narrative kind of splits and could go one of two directions, even if it comes back together at a certain point, that's a branch to me.
And I think it's not even necessary. So I'd say, a branching narrative is one where it's possible for two players to play the game and in describing the events of the game, have meaningfully different stories to tell. And I've done two projects, I think Shattered Memories and War Games, both were heavily branching narratives that, if you laid out a tree or attempted to kind of map the content, it would look similar to what you might see in, say, a BioWare game. And the big difference there was that in both those games, the players were not making conscious choices. The code and in representing me as the author was making choices for them. So everyone got this unique, different narrative, different plot, different moments, but there wasn't a conscious choice, which I think for me is a useful way of differentiating some things. Because I think often when people talk about branching narratives, it's more the choices that they're thinking about than necessarily even like the structure of the narrative or how it might branch.
Well, when I was growing up, I was fascinated by the Choose Your Own Adventure books early on. And that's actually, I still have the ones I would write. I would do those when I was like probably 10, from age 10 to 12. I got really obsessed with them and did my own, because it was a fun thing you could do yourself. You could actually create kind of your own mini game, just with paper. You could lead people onto these different adventures. And it was a great prelude to Dungeons and Dragons, which is another, to me, choice-based branching narrative, because you don't know where the player is going to go. You have to kind of, even though you have a map there, you have to plan for the tangents to go off. And it's a natural, not all writers, and I know that some people can't, the branching is difficult for some people. I know I'm a screenwriter, I know it's hard for some screenwriters to see those kind of branching, and so I know it's a different technique, but I definitely think that the Choose Your Adventure books, and it's just a natural progression to what we have now. That's why I like The Strange. I was early on, to me, this is like the greatest Choose Your Own Adventure book. And I approached it like that. I wrote it like I had the chance to write, for me, like a great Choose Your Own Adventure book.
I think the interesting thing with the Choose Your Own Adventures is maybe even a third category. Like a lot of those books didn't even branch in the way that people imagine a branching narrative to be. And like some of the more popular Choose Your Own Adventure books were kind of choose not to die, right? Like the structure was heavily leaning towards, if you made the wrong choices, it would be game over and you'd kind of back up. So you had this constant illusion of choice and of peril. But I think the popular culture idea of branching narrative is, I guess, most reflected in like people like Roger Ebert saying, how would Hamlet work if it was a branching narrative and if the audience was choosing what Hamlet did at every point? And it's this idea of a story that kind of can go anywhere, essentially, which is probably very few of the games that we've worked on.
It's interesting that you bring that up about how a lot of choices in early like choose your own adventure novels just lead to fail conditions. A lot of us are working in interactive television now, and TV for the first time is sort of walking into this space that I think video games have been in for a really, really long time. TV is new to it. So you have a lot of people in TV who don't have any experience with or like a deeper knowledge of interactive gameplay. And so I have found that a lot, that often they continually default to like, there's a right choice and a wrong choice. And you're just dying all the time. If you go in one direction, there's no sort of like, I feel like video games has like we have 30 years of experience in this industry, if not more, of like, what are the other kinds of consequences for your actions that you can have, be they small or huge or world shattering or whatever, beyond you died. And it'll be interesting to see TV sort of run with that and develop in their own direction, I think.
Yeah, I've definitely been in meetings, with maybe even some with Graham, where the idea that's fixed in people's head, which does go back to choose your own adventure and is almost the idea of branching narrative. And then you'll have someone in the corner of the room, sometimes me, kind of inwardly screaming that, that through interactive fiction and RPGs and computer RPGs and all these different things, we've spent 30 years iterating and having more nuanced ideas than, the binary choice, wrong or right.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of video games, historically, that was sort of the thing that determined progression or not progression, which was just the fail state. It was like, did you fall in a pit? Did you run into a monster? Did you die? And then you start over and you progress again until you pass all those fail states. But that doesn't really happen in narrative. It kind of can't happen in narrative. Everything has to be moving forward, and everything has to add up to some amount of meaning, whether that's a very curated meaning or not. It still has to add up to that meaning in the player's head. So hitting those fail states will immediately pull them out of the world of the story in a way that you kind of never experience in a linear traditional narrative. And that actually kind of leads me to another question, which is, I know a lot of us have come from more traditional linear writing or worked in it alongside interactive. We don't all always get to choose which stories we work on, but the way that we choose the types of stories that we're telling in those stories is something we always have a say in internally in our heads. And I wonder, is there something about a particular story or a particular emotional experience that you want to express that makes you choose, okay, this is something suited for something more linear, or this is something suited for something more interactive, because this version of the interactive story will express something to the audience that a linear version can't, or vice versa?
Yeah, I think it's all form follows function, or function follows form. I still can't figure out which one that is, but it's what it is. It dictates the story dictates, the media dictates what the story is, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, maybe the Hamlet situation, I think the Hamlet where you spin off is in your mind. You think about what does this mean? That's kind of like the branching in your mind in terms of the story. Whereas in a game, you get the emotional satisfaction of creating different. And I think just in terms of process, which I like to talk about for people out there that are interested in writing for games, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. For me, it's hard for, we're all familiar with this, but branching to me is very simple, because to me, it's like you don't want to lose the forest for the branching, et cetera, but you just follow one story to its end. Even when you're just branching, you follow that story, then you don't think about all those other things, because you'll go insane when you see this Excel and you see the YED and the layout, So I think it's just a matter of, you get the chance as a writer and a creator to follow all these different stories to different endings and create them. That's the exciting thing. So it's not, you see, I put equal weight in every single branch. Like you have to put equal narrative weight, emotional weight, character weight, and not treat everything as, there can be fun branching, of course, off to nowhere and back again. But yeah, that's a short version of that.
I just want to give a quick shout out as well, Christian. You keep mentioning like Hamlet or branching Shakespeare. A friend of mine actually makes those books, Ryan North. He writes Squirrel Girl, and he's written a bunch of video games as well. But
Wow.
he has a couple books out. One of them is called Romeo and or Juliet, and the other one is called To Be or Not to Be, That is the Adventure. And they're choose your own path adventure books based on Shakespeare, and I feel like they take that original choose your own adventure model and really like bring it into the 21st century. So if you guys are interested, or if anybody watching is interested in that like exact hypothetical, it does exist, and they're really good.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. I'll check that out for sure. Yeah, that's great.
I think the Hamlet example is largely bullshit as well. Like if I'm going to be cynical, I'd say what determines where a story belongs is sometimes who's going to pay for it. Which every time a new storytelling format comes along, you see every writer who has a screenplay on the shelf kind of be like, this is perfect for VR, because it's not been sold as a movie or whatever. But I think the thing that fascinates me is, and it's surprising that someone like Roger Ebert would have that opinion, because he would, I imagine, have been pretty knowledgeable about the craft. But like, as any writer knows, the writing process, and whether or not there is an author leading it, is very iterative. And I mean, there are very famous examples even of movies, say, that have been shot, tested, and the ending changes. In fact, more often than not, in the kind of bigger productions, Dickens would put out his books volume at a time, and he would change endings. Great Expectations is a great example where he came up with an alternate ending because people didn't like how it ended. And when you're in the writing room and you're breaking a scene, whether it's linear or not, you might come in with an idea of where this scene is going to go, and when you finish writing it, it's gone somewhere else. And sometimes those decisions, they're not arbitrary, but you can understand how they could equally go in different directions. And I think some of the beauty of writing in interactive is pulling the audience into that fluid state. And we're still exploring characters, and we're still exploring thematically what the story is saying, but living in that slightly more fluid state, I think, lets you enjoy it in like a slightly more kind of immersive way.
Yeah, when Sam was talking about who's going to pay for it, that it has to dictate a lot of, at least in games, it has to dictate a lot of how much branching can we do. When Christian was talking about it, branching narrative sort of feeding off of, or being similar to D&D, I think that's a pretty good parallel for it, because anyone who's played in a game, much less DM'd a game, knows the amount of planning that has to go into, you can't just plan for one story. You have to plan for a whole bunch of them, and you may not even get to this place that you've planned for. So, if you're going to change the action, change an outcome, you have to plan way out for that. And that can get exponentially complicated very quickly. And so I'm probably biased by where I work, but exploring character relationships is I think is a good type of writing, because you can still feel some way, AKA want to romance everyone, or not. And that doesn't, how you interact with those individual characters and character types doesn't dictate, the plot's going to change completely. So that's one way to kind of keep things relatively on the rails in terms of the plot you're telling, but just explore all over the place with characters and themes interacting with other humans or not humans. So character type relationships, you can really get into a lot of interesting exploration in a bunch of different ways without it requiring you to make like 70 different levels that people may never see.
I think those are as well the interesting choices. I mean, there is this constant battle between what I think is still the marketing idea of branching narrative and the reality for developers and players, in that, you know, the classic choose your own adventure is anything could happen. We could go to a different planet, go here, we could save the world, not save the world, like all these different options are open to us. And sometimes if you have a game where everyone gets the same ending, and I remember, like, I don't think it's true anymore. It used to be that like reviewers, if they were reviewing your game with branches, would feel that it was their job to have to play it 3 times and assess like how truly branching it was. But to a player, like, does the world get saved in an epic sci-fi story? Probably. Like, that A plot is the least interesting thing in the story, because we know how these stories play out. If I go and see a big Marvel movie, I'm pretty sure things are going to follow a certain curve, but the stuff I dig and really am interested in are those character moments, and that's where it can get more subjective, and where, you know, different people are going to dig particular characters or want to mix things around. So at the end of the day, do the good guys destroy the alien menace is less interesting than do these 2 people fall in love? Like, my go-to example from Linear is The Verdict. It's a wonderful movie, and the A plot of that movie is, will Paul Newman get redemption and win this big trial? Spoilers, he does. But the really interesting beat is, will he continue his relationship with Charlotte Rampling, who betrayed him? And the movie does not answer that question. Like, it goes out, you see her calling him, and it cuts before he answers the phone. And that's like the super interesting, rich content in that story, is this relationship between these 2 people. So I think it's not even like being clever and economical, right? It's actually, where interestingly do we want to put this subjectivity and this variation?
I think that's an interesting point, because it differentiates between what people determine or think of as plot, because there's almost always 2 plots going on in any narrative, linear or interactive, and especially in interactive, where you have a literal plot, which is just, do we save the world or not, or whatever, and then there's an emotional plot. And the emotional plot, especially in something interactive, the literal plot is something that players or viewers are wondering about, and they're just kind of waiting to see what happens. But the emotional plot is what they're living and what they're experiencing internally or empathizing with. And so in interactive, they're empathizing in ways that you really never could in linear, because you're taking agency over the characters. When you guys approach characters in interactive, does this affect the way that you think about the characters that you're writing? Is there do you think of them almost more cloud-based as potential rather than like A to B to C, or do you still have to find a kind of more linear structure to start with to approach it?
Well, I think you have to, depends once again, it's form follows function. What are you doing with those characters? What's the ending for their, I think that we were talking, you were talking about a golden age of narrative video games. And I've always said it's a blue age, which is kind of my theory about not the new age. We're in a blue age, which is a technological age and a screen, the blue glow. And so to me, it's a blue age of storytelling. It's really a great, great, great time for storytelling because of this. And just from my own experience with Life is Strange, I mean, I know I've gotten immersively attached to characters in games, et cetera, movies, blah, blah, blah. But watching, players have these relationships with the characters in Life is Strange, where people are crying and having these really, I was like, this is something different to me. This feels very different. And of course, the agency that you have when you're the player is so much more unique and so personalized than when you're watching a movie. You instantly become that you're connected to that. So I think that's, and what we talk about Roger Ebert, I purposely slipped in Russ Meyer's name in Life is Strange because Roger Ebert famously said that video games could not be art. And of course he was completely wrong about that. And I think if he was around now, he would completely be like, yeah, it's cool. Okay. But he wasn't seeing it, then. But I think, I just think that right now we're in such a great age where characters and narrative is so important and so intertwined, and I'm sure everybody else has their own take on how this, plays out right now. But I just think that's the cool thing going on right now.
Yeah, I think if you approach branching narrative from a standpoint of, again, this is something I'm seeing in TV a lot, is if you approach it from the standpoint of like, I'm going to write out the whole linear narrative as if I was writing a normal script, and then I'll just like add branches. That Yeah, Sam's like freaking out. Yeah, it's frustrating because at that point you've sort of established the correct path. You've established like the actual path that you want players to follow, and then the side ones, like Christian was saying, like every path actually has to have the same amount of emotional resonance and importance and heart in it as the, you know, as each other. So starting out with like this main path and then adding branches, I think is not an ideal way to go about crafting a branching narrative. I think you have to think about it as each one is a separate story that makes an equal amount of sense, that a player would equally want to do, even if that means giving a character a bunch of different personality types. I think like Hawk in Dragon Age 2 is a great example of that, where like the choices that you make as Hawk are kind of based on what kind of person you want to be, and there's no wrong way to be that person, but they are very different people depending on the choices that you make, but there's no correct version of that person, and so you really have to write every single kind as though it's where you're supposed to go. I branched a bunch of different places there, but you understand what I'm saying. I think it's not a great way to plan a branching story by making a linear story, but it makes sense.
I mean, so having been in the room and seen that happen several times, like I think the huge problem you get there is, for me, like the most interesting branching narratives where choice is involved, those choices should be the key plot beats, right? Like the choice, through those choices, you're either defining the character or you're expressing your take on the character to the game/author. And when people do that thing of laying out the story and then adding choice, usually they're adding choices in redundant, pointless ways. Like the example I would always give would be like, you know, being asked which soft drink would you like is like a dumb choice. So I had no judgment when people were asked what breakfast cereal to choose in the Netflix thing. But for me, yeah, that, I mean, I'm very interested in what it feels like to write this kind of BioWare style narrative where often you do get these kind of bigger character choices. Because certainly when I've written, it's usually been in this fluid space. Like when I was doing the War Games character Kelly, it was like we had this very specific, real idea of this character. But like any human being, based on what somebody says to her, what side of the bed she gets out of, she can go different ways and it's still true to that character. And she's still exploring these relationships and themes. Whereas I guess, and again, like if I relate this back to a linear writing process, I think people would be surprised at how fluid, like there is no canon within the writing process, right? You might get to a bit and you're like, this scene just isn't working. And you swap lines between characters. You're like, we're going to take all the lines that the detective had and we're going to give them to this other character, right? And you might tweak them for character voice, but like one of the things you do to mix up narrative is to throw stuff around like that. But yeah, those particularly, like if I think I played BioWare games and my character ends up being horrible racist, right? And you can probably go in a very different way. How do you go about conceptualizing that character when you have these bigger shifts?
Well, two things. First, there is a difference in how we approach the player character, the protagonist, and then the companion characters. And the protagonist can vary. Like the Inquisitor in Dragon Age Inquisition was fairly blank slate, and so you could apply. We tried to set it up so you could apply a lot more personality. The way you reacted to something, you're going to be straightforward. You can be kind of a smart aleck about it, where you're going to be nice to people, supportive. So we will add those flavors and think about, okay, when you are getting through a scene, does it make sense to have the player character react to something in a flavor way? A particular something explodes. Are they happy that it exploded? Are they going to be a wise ass about it? Are they worried that the thing exploded? And so the writers will work with each of those different voices. And quite a bit of discussion goes into what kind of voices do we want those to be? And so they keep that in mind as they're writing. But with like Hawk or or the twins in Andromeda, that we have given the player a little bit more of a personality. So they will have their own backstory and a little bit more of, how they react to things. The spread isn't going to be as wide. And so when it's that, some of the effort goes into creating that backstory more than we would for a blank character or blank slate character. And then the rest of it goes into how are we going to tweak it? How are we going to, what's going to be fun? And a lot of it is fun. What is going to be, if I want to be a smart ass, I would love to say that I always think of 15 minutes after I've had whatever altercation I've had with someone. I want that to be the line that I say. And the other thing that we do is for every game and every major mission within that game, we'll have themes. And so we try to keep those discussions. It's not right or wrong. It's, we're exploring faith. There's myriad different ways for people to respond to faith. So those themes can help us kind of organize ideas in terms of, because you don't want to go too far and write too many things, but, so we can pull conversations back going, does that fit with this theme? Not really. Let's save that and use it for something else. But the theme can be sort of an overarching umbrella that helps focus the conversations and help them hopefully make sense as they relate to each other.
I remember there's a rule of thumb I was told by another writer from Outside Interactive that was the more contradictions a character has, the more interesting and complex they are. But you should ration out your contradictions. So the protagonist of a story is allowed to have lots of contradictions, and that makes them real and interesting. So Hamlet is a good example of a character that behaves differently in lots of different contexts. So I think I've always been surprised at how readily the audience will synthesize a character that, if you laid out, if you start scrutinizing and questioning the causality and the logic of things they're doing, you can create a composite character, but if they have the same player mesh and voice actor throughout, it's then on the player to kind of make that feel like, well, this is the character. And I guess the more involved the player is in that process, they're already bought in. Like if they've decided a character is going to do a thing or act a certain way, then their imagination is already meshed in with that.
Yeah, it's sort of the equivalent of an interactive Kuleshov effect in film. You put two images back to back, and the audience will, make the equation work, or blood in the gutter in comics. Like it's just that space between the two things, and then they'll put it together. I'm also wondering. I know this comes up a lot when I'm working on stuff. I worry that players will be given options at times for a character that might be something that they as a person would want to do, but might betray who the character is to the writer at that point. And we're always having to find this balancing act between, okay, how much of a collaborator in the writing process is the player allowed to be in this moment? And is that something to worry about? Is that something you guys worry about? Or, Sammy, we're kind of just talking about this, but I'm sort of curious about everybody's take on it. Like, is that something you think about while you're writing characters?
Well, you have to, because in the sense of, I find it fascinating because I'll use Life is Strange example because what I know is just watching players decide to become. There are two types of modes. It seem like people choose to do exactly what they think Max would do, or they would choose what they want Max to do. And that is just interesting. You would just totally see that play out. It was very fascinating. Maybe there's another hybrid of that, but people would be like, no, Max would not do that. Max would do this. Other people are like, Chloe's living, or whatever, like people have put their agency into that. And I found that emotional connection that's really powerful. And at some point it kind of leaves, not when you're writing it per se, because you're writing it sometimes you're writing games, we're writing Life is Strange as players reacting to it. So episodic is a little bit different because we're getting feedback in real time, so to speak. And as people should understand, a game can't be really changed overnight or that drastically. It's just the time it takes, development, the mocap, animation, voice, all this stuff. It's very hard just to throw something or change it. We did add one scene with Kate, a character, because we love the character and we were able to, and it was a nice little scene we could throw in there based on the amount of character response, the audience response. But I do find it fascinating the way that the player agency, some people want to live out vicariously through the character, and some people want to put their own emotional projection into that character and create that world.
I think people might find it really interesting to know. I was just asking my partner, who used to be a producer at BioWare as well, and people generally just want to be nice. Like, people want to be nice. I think something, he said 8% of players in Mass Effect play Renegade. 8. That's not a lot of players. Like, 92% of people just want to be nice to the video game characters. And you know what? I think that's something about that really like warms my heart. Generally, everyone is
Give
good.
me hope. Life is strange. Just throw it in there. Seriously, so many people chose not to do the mean thing. It actually gave me great hope for the future. I'm not kidding. I really feel that way.
It's
I,
amazing.
Yeah, and I think there are people who want to try it just to be like, oh, what? But when I actually punch someone, I feel horrible. Like, every once in a while, it can be vicarious thrill, but yeah, it's
I think this is one
people
of,
want to
again,
watch
like,
other people punching them. They don't want to do it themselves.
it's like one of the things that we know about, but is not necessarily the marketing pitch, is that very often having the evil thing to do as an option exists more to make the good option feel good, right? The fact that you could have gone that way, because everyone thinks of themselves as a hero, whatever narrative you're in, right? But I think, yeah, those are, and kind of back to what you're saying, Graham, like in linear, you call it dramatic irony, right? When the audience knows something that the character doesn't, has a different frame of reference, and is therefore willing them to do something. And that conflict between the character's knowledge and your knowledge, and the strange, like even watching a movie, you exist in this strange middle ground between being moved by the character's plight, seeing through their eyes, and still having the perspective. And like 99% of Hitchcock movies and suspense movies are built around what the audience wants the character to do, or what they know is going to, or think is going to happen when the character does the thing. So for me, like shifting the brain between linear and interactive it's not that big a difference. It's still, we're in this mushy thing, right, between these different ideas.
I think we're going to try to take a few questions from the chat. Okay, let's see. Audience question: what tools for branching writing do the studios you work at have? Does anyone want to jump in with the trade secrets?
I started out for Life is Strange. I kind of did it when I got the game. I did a Twine test. I kind of, I think Twine is a fantastic tool. If people don't know about it, it's probably one of the best to me. Like, this instant narrative, branching tools. It's fantastic. It's very, you can learn it really quick, and you can show people what you can do. By the way, with I was able to use that as part of my test for Life is Strange. So, and we have I think every company has proprietary software for this. So I think it's all different, but we have our own software. But we also use graphs and Excel, all sorts of different charts, and it's handwriting. So it's multi-format.
Yeah, I use Twine for my BioWare test as well. Twine is such a great tool, especially because you can make and finish a game by yourself with no other design experience, and then you have something to show people as an example of your work. Often if you're trying to get into games writing professionally, people want to see something that you've made. Not a lot of people have made, finished, and published something, so Twine is a really good way to do that and to show that you're able to, just the ability to finish something puts you like far ahead of the pack, honestly, in terms of everybody else who just wants to be a writer, just make something. At BioWare, we had our own tool within Frostbite, but there are versions of that for Unity that are functionally identical. I think like Inkle is out there now, and there are lots of different ways, but at all the other studios I've worked at, they use Excel spreadsheets. It's terrible.
We did the first version of Until Dawn, the PS3 Until Dawn that was canceled. We did in Excel, and it was a nightmare.
Right.
I'm gonna stand up for Excel.
Sam basically said another thing we do use is Visio to plot out some of the branching, just very high level beat by beat. If you make this choice, here's what's happened. Here's what happens, just to make sure that we aren't giving short shrift to one of the branches. So that can be helpful just for the basic logic to visualize it before you start writing any words. That's another thing that can be useful.
Well, I find that it's actually, as a screenwriter and writer, I will, for certain scripts, I'll lay out cards, index cards, and put a scene on there and lay it out. And you end up with kind of an emotional board that's got 3 acts or so. And you can totally do that with branching narrative. And a lot of Life is Strange dialogues, I just, working with narrative designers on my own, I would just branch out writing it. Just, you can kind of see a visual, emotional story kind of be created in that kind of visual space there.
The kinds of things I've created, my thing is that I never want the audience to see the graph, right? The node diagram. So I've usually worked in setups that can't be mapped out with a diagram, that are more kind of fluid, which end up being Excel, weird macros and stuff. But also the ink language, I think, is the most wonderful for writing essentially text-based things. Like the beauty of that, and there's a similar language, choice script, where you're just writing in a text document. So you're writing as a writer, and then you'll just put some little symbols in, and it will kind of start creating nested branches and stuff. But those are like super fun tools for people that want to stay in a text editor, but still have all this kind of richness.
Let's do one more question. What are some tricks or tips to making branching narratives have high replayability? It's an interesting question. Anyone want to jump in with that?
You have to make each storyline as powerful as the previous one. And I think every game, is what Sam was talking about earlier in terms of I have a theory too. Like, there's not everything is suited to a branching narrative. There's some stories that I want that linears have that, and we should have plenty. I don't want just one choice. I want a buffet of choices. So literally, but with that buffet, I don't mind that. I'm totally okay with linear narratives. And so I think the replayability comes, and if Life is Strange, I just saw it firsthand, like people will go over and play every branch. They'll find every branch. They go through every branch. They will go through everything in that game. They go through every single thing. And so, and we were trying to make everything important too, and fun and interesting. So that's one reason why I actually go back. It's like, don't throw away a branch on something that doesn't mean anything. Have it mean, even a joke, have it, have there be a reason, I think. And I think that's just having an emotional reason to go back is probably the replayability part of it.
I should also say Life is Strange is a great example, and one of the things that I was impressed by with it when it first came out was the core mechanic of shifting time is like an exercise in dialogue tree replayability, because you get through a dialogue tree, you get a new piece of information, you pull back in time, and you can replay it again instantly with a new context. And that's one of the things about interactivity that is really important in terms of replayability, but also just like that Kuleshov effect thing again, where you can have branches of a story that are virtually the same, but you have a different piece of information at the beginning of it that makes it a new branch for the player, which is a really cool recontextualization.
And that is a unique experience as well. I think Emily Short has written nicely about this, but like something unique to branching narratives is the fact that you're holding those multiple threads in your head. Like, and maybe the first one you saw is the most real, or maybe the one that ultimately you liked is the one that's more real, but you have this kind of thing floating around. I mean, I've seen interesting stats that when people replay branching games, sometimes they can't avoid making the same choices again, because like, these are the choices I'm drawn towards. Whereas there are definitely a subset of players that are gonna kind of lawnmower every single option to kind of map out that whole thing.
Looks like we're getting the 2-minute warning, so I think we should wrap up and plug some projects. Why don't we go in the same order as before, clockwise on my screen? Christian, why don't you go for it?
I'm working on NDA. Some projects. We're fortunate as a writer. I'm sure some of you feel the same way. This is a very, strange, terrible time. We're very fortunate that we're used to working remotely, maybe our whole lives in a certain way. Maybe some of us have been doomsday prepped for this by being geek fans and apocalyptic fans and dystopia and, living in our own little world. So we're kind of very fortunate if we can do that right now. So projects like that, working on a novel and Life is Strange 2 is still out right now, so you can still get that on all the various platforms.
And where can we find you online?
I am primarily on Twitter, Christian Devine at Chris Devine on Twitter, so you can find me around there.
Cool. Sam Barlow.
What am I working on? Yeah, we finished Telling Lies last year with Annapurna. We have a console port coming out next week for PlayStation, Xbox, and Switch of that wonderful award-winning narrative game with a cast to die for, doing all sorts of interesting things. And we started fully working on our next project this year. We've moved into a new office and built the team up to then all start working from home, which was exciting. That is the most ambitious thing I've done yet. It is going to be a horror game, which I'm very excited about. Graham will know that I am a big fan of horror. So this is a return to that genre for me. Has a working title that of Project Ambrosio. And we'll probably start talking about it at some point this year.
And where are you online?
Yeah, hit me up on Twitter where I am Mr. Sam Barlow, Mr. Sam Barlow. The formal title is important.
And Karin, what are you working on and where can we find you?
I am working on a technically unannounced project. If you follow BioWare at all and care, you can probably guess what it is. It may or may not have to do dragons, but it is technically unannounced. So I'm working on that, and I'm on Twitter at just my name, Karin Weekes, Karin with an I, and Weekes with an extra E at the end.
Cool. And Sam Maggs?
Yeah, so none of the games that I've worked on over the last 2 years are announced, so I can't talk about them. One day I'll be able to talk about them. But if you want to support me in my work, you can pick up Marvel Action Captain Marvel, the comics, right now. The first trade is out, Cosmic Catastrophe. And also, if you pre-order my books, that'd be amazing. The Unstoppable Wasp is out July 14th. And my first middle grade novel, Conquest, if you're missing conventions, you should check out this novel about two kids at a convention in a scavenger hunt. And you can find me on Twitter and Instagram, just my name, Sam Maggs, SAMMAGGS, and you can buy my books through there, please. This is so much fun.
Yeah. And I'm Graham Resnick, at Graham Resnick with a Z. I can't talk about my upcoming game projects, but you can check out Dead Wax on Shudder if you like records and horror and science fiction and mystery and those kinds of things. And I have some music on Mondo Death Waltz and Burning Witches Records. Thank you, fellow traveler, for having us. Thank you, Christian, Sam, and Karin. This was awesome to talk to everybody. I wish we had 3 hours to talk about all this stuff. We go on forever.
We're not going anywhere.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I hope everybody
People just need to rewind, go back to the start, and make different choices.
Exactly.
You're not trapped here with you.
All right. Well, I hope everybody's being safe and enjoying their quarantine. So,
Ciao.